Once again, everyone, we're going to be getting started in a few seconds, probably about 30. Okay, why don't we get started? So once again, my name is Kwame Spearman. I'm the CEO and co-owner of Tattered Cover, which is located in Denver, Colorado, actually the Denver metro area, so we can just say Colorado. We are an independent bookstore, and we are super thrilled to be partnering to have this amazing author talk. I think one of the things that I always emphasize whenever I kick these things off is you're dealing with a lot of independent organizations, and we are so pro independent organizations as an independent bookseller. I want to thank our partner for this event, World Denver, who is going to be saying a few things to you at the end of the presentation, but I wanted them to get some love at the beginning. Please check them out. They are an absolutely wonderful global organization. And then Just World Books, which is an independent publisher, which is really the reason why we're here, has done just a fantastic job. They're an amazing house with a lot of interesting reads. And please also check them out. I'd also like to introduce the two people who you're going to be hearing from. I'll start with our moderator, Donna. So Donna is, I mean, if you just Google her, you're going to be reading about her forever. I'll tell you a very personal story about Donna. I moved back to Denver 8 weeks ago, but over the summer, I had the opportunity to go to her beautiful home and have a socially distant glass of wine on her patio and learn more about her. She is a world-renowned reporter, writer, author, and as I think everyone is going to view today, she's a wonderful interviewer and someone who I'm starting to call a friend. So very happy to introduce you to Donna. And then obviously the reason why we're all here is Shanthini, who has put together just an absolutely fascinating novel that hits on topics that, quite frankly, we need to be discussing more. I believe you're in South Africa right now, so I want to thank you for accommodating a U.S. time, the U.S. time zone right now. But without further ado, I want you all to jump in and start having the conversation. So Shanthini, Donna, welcome. Thank you. We all look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Kwame, for that welcome. And so thanks to the magic of the internet, Shanthini is with us from Johannesburg, where it is summer. So let's just all think about that for a minute. In Johannesburg, she works in content marketing. Previously, she was a journalist for South Africa's Sunday Times. It was while she was reporting for the Sunday Times that Shanthini first learned of the historic events that are at the heart of women surviving apartheid's prisons, this is the U.S. edition of the book. I think Shanthini hasn't been able to hold it in her hand, but here we are. She's also written for the Times newspaper and for O Magazine. And I'm going to start by asking her to read a bit about yourself from the book.
Thank you so much, Donna. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone being here. Well, maybe it would have been more difficult for us to be together in the snowy weather, but thank you for coming. And Donna has asked me to read a passage about how I stumbled across the story. So it says, "You will, I hope, have noticed my name, Shanthini Naidoo. Let me say at the outset that it's purely coincidental and not a literary device, as one of the early editors thought that I do share a name or a derivative of it with Shanti Naidoo, who's one of the women in the book. There's no bloodline between us of which I'm aware, but the connection of our names provided coincidence upon coincidence. Shanti is retired now and lives in Johannesburg. She returned to South Africa from the United Kingdom in 1994, and she's one of the reasons why this story found me, and I'm glad for it. Joyce Sigakane Rankin agreed to speak to me almost by mistake, or perhaps charmed by the confusion about her friend with the similar name. And for Joyce's children, who thought I was a great granddaughter of their mum's friend, whom they had never met. For the other two women in the book, Manondwe and Marita, it was a memory trigger, hearing a name from a story they hadn't revisited for many years. And the coincidence brought a unique way into their homes and to their minds. And for this, I'm thankful for a name that has been mispronounced all of my adult life. The connection binds me to Shanthini Naidoo in a way that's inspiring, but mostly because she lives her Shanti, peace, as it's translated, more than any other human being I've met.
And as you say in that passage, the story found you. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit what you mean by that.
So I actually spoke about this earlier today to a group of young people. My career in journalism was not as a political journalist. It was really as a features writer, and I did look at social justice issues and things like that. But I also focused on health and wellness and various other things. But at the time of Winnie Mandela's death, when I was sent to do a feature um, on her prison experience, was when I came across the trial for the first time in my career as a journalist. And it was at the Pretoria Central Prison, where these women were held in solitary confinement. And it was just almost a travesty to me that their names weren't better known, that I didn't know about them, and that South Africa wasn't celebrating them more. The women were all still alive and are still alive and were in their latter days, very quietly going about their time in South Africa, even though they'd contributed so much to the history of it. So to the history of our freedom, rather. So apologies. So the story came from reporting on Winnie Mandela's death, and then evolved into an academic work because I decided to study this while I was doing my master's at the University of the Witwatersrand here. And it's just more and more patterns emerged in not just their stories, the emotional and the mental effects of their time in solitary confinement. And also then it led to parallels to the Me Too movement, um, and in so many ways evolved into something that was absolutely relevant in 2018, which was 50 years after their detention. So it it came to me and it found me through the name, as you said, with Auntie Shanthini Naidoo, who's in the book, and also just by the nature of their story being such a powerful a female story, which resonated so much with me as a mother of young children. So yes, it found me and it grabbed me in many ways.
Yeah. And as you say, you met these women 50 years after they had been detained for their work in the anti-apartheid movement. The apartheid government was hoping just by holding them, by torturing them, would force them to testify against each other and against others who had been arrested. And they refused. From the first moment they were brought before the judge, they refused to bear false witness, even though it meant more time in prison pending trial. And in the end, the government had to retreat, had to acknowledge that they didn't have any evidence, and they were all released. And this trial was after the trial that sent Nelson Mandela to Robben Island. And I think the government was hoping that this trial would be the final nail that would seal away the African National Congress, and it did not. A story that was forgotten in South Africa until you brought it back to light. This edition is the American edition. The South African edition has been out, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what kind of reaction you've had from South African readers.
Wow, it's been really amazing. I started the book. With our Constitution, which is our the American equivalent is your I'm sorry, I'm gonna mess it up if I try. I've forgotten now, but it's our founding document, and it is it's new. It is something that came that was born with the democratic South Africa, and it says in that constitution how we should honor and respect those who came before us. And although South Africans have great pride and honor in the leaders, and in particularly the male leaders like Nelson Mandela, who obviously is a considered the father of our nation, and many others who were around him. There was a missing part of that narrative, which was, where were the women and who were the women that were involved in the movement when these leaders particularly were in exile and in prison. And if you research it a little more, there were definitely a number of activists who were a part of the scaffolding, but the women were particularly important because of their of the role, particularly starting with Winnie Mandela as a figurehead, and many others around her. So the reaction was that from South Africans was, firstly, who were these women? And also, I was pleased and displeased to hear that I wasn't the only one who didn't know about them. Many people had not heard about them and expressed afterwards how important it was for them to have read this and to now know these stories. And, while they recognize that there is space in history for the Nelson Mandelas and the Winnie Mandelas, there's lots of space for many other people who were also involved in the fight for democracy. It was, it was 50 decades of multi-phase struggles, and there were many people involved in them. So I think that was the best reaction, was for people to become curious, to try and find out more about these women particularly, and the other stalwarts of the South African struggle.
And I like that idea of space for history. And I should add that there is space for questions from our audience. If you could just drop questions in, there's a Q&A button you'll see next to the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and we will definitely get to those. Curious, has there anything about the reaction in South Africa that surprised you, Shanthini?
I wouldn't say it's surprising, because this book is based on knowing that there was a missing narrative, and that there was a lens that will always be focused on the male leaders and the male narrative. But to still, even after highlighting the role of women and of other people in our struggle for democracy, to still hear that, the negative comments about leaders like Winnie Mandela. But for instance, she became comments that she became militant and was also unethical in some ways, and all of this may be part of her history and part of who she was. But I think the thing that is important to take away from it is that I think the story highlights one of the themes is generational trauma, and how it is to hear that that people still feel a certain way without knowing everything that has happened in our history, without knowing the full history, can still feel a certain way towards each other. It shows that there is, again, space for knowledge building, and for for sort of ignorance to go away, because only once we realize what we don't know will we seek it. And that's, I think, a very big part of South Africa's healing process, which has happened to some extent, but definitely needs much more work. And in fact, that's true around the world.
And speaking of knowing our history, here in the US, we hear the phrase, "This is not who we are," after eruptions of violence, such as the January 6th attack on our Capitol. I don't recall hearing that kind of sentiment in South Africa, even after events such as the attack on the World Trade Center. You described this in your book, and I was in Johannesburg then when white extremists stormed what was called the World Trade Center, a conference center outside Johannesburg where leaders were negotiating the end of apartheid. Do South Africans say something similar to "this is not who we are"?
I think we're in a better space now than back then. It's a very new history that we're building. We are around 30 years into democracy, and that's not a long time. And unfortunately, there's so much to unravel that it will take a lot longer. And it's really relevant that you ask that. The women in the book actually say, even though their story is 50 years old, they still say how much time it will take to repair a lot of what has happened in the past. And I think we are moving towards it. We are definitely not in the space that we should be. South Africans still, and I've written this in the book, I don't think we identify with each other as well as we could. I don't think we see each other. And that's why we end up with these microaggressions and the strange corporate atmosphere that we sometimes experience. It's because we don't know each other's backstory, and we possibly haven't taken the time to do it. We had our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was, a number of years of people applying for amnesty, of telling their stories, and of the victims coming forward. But there were hundreds of thousands of people who didn't come forward at that time. And it was meant to be a sort of band-aid over the gigantic wound that was apartheid. And, it sort of ended there. I'm not sure if there was a lot of work done afterwards in terms of psychological debriefing and things like that. I mean, the women in the book certainly didn't have it. So that generational trauma, I believe, is definitely still with us. It's why we have issues like the Fees Must Fall movement, which you might know about, Donna, from being here, but it was where university students were protesting against paying for tertiary education because they felt that as part of reparations that it should be free. So this will continue. We've got economic battles that ensure that this will continue. So I think parallel to the economic rebuild is the psychological rebuild. And it takes a lot for South Africans to firstly acknowledge that there is something that we need to work on, and then to actually do it, to take the time to do it.
I'm going to ask you to read another passage. This one is about Rita Nzanga, who's one of the women you profile in the book.
Rita Nzanga, I'm just going to go to that passage. Sorry, Donna. Apologies. So Marita was actually, just to share a little bit with the audience, is one of the central figures of the nonfiction story. And she and her husband were actually part of the trial, but I focused on the woman just in terms of the lack of recognition of women in our history, which is why I've highlighted the woman in the trial of 22. So she was imprisoned with her husband, and very sadly had to leave her children behind. Sorry, I'm just getting to that passage. Apologies. It would be much easier if I had the copy of my book, but it will arrive soon.
Being able to word search is actually.
Yes. We're on page 94.
Mm-hmm.
Marita still lives in the house she shared with Lawrence, her husband, on Koma Road, Senouane, Soweto. She says, in the country right now, we've never lived like the way we are living. We've got lives, really. We wanted our dignity back. She dismisses any consideration of psychological help. I didn't have any counseling. I only went to a doctor when I felt pain or if I didn't have tablets. I still take tablets. She gestures to her forearm. If you see my arm where I fell after she was dropped onto bricks and fell onto a gas pipe, she says, I could feel the pain from here. Sometimes I can hardly pick up my hand. It's painful. I'm tired. People think we don't want to associate anymore, but it's because of these sicknesses. All of that comes from detention without trial.
And could you tell us about the questions your research raised in your own mind? You talked about this a little bit already, about the impact of trauma on detainees, their families, and their communities.
Yes, it was really interesting for me to speak to the families of these women and to see how their children were affected, because their children are they are compatriots. They are the people that we work with and who we would encounter in the ordinary world, and they had impact of missing parents for and not knowing where their parents were for months on end, of being moved around, of being moving countries even when the women were in exile. And it was very interesting to firstly see that it wasn't a norm for people to seek psychological help. It was also something that wasn't accessible at the time. If you think about it, there was so little that was accessible to South Africans of color that psychology would come in, at the very end after survival. And what I found was that the generation, and it is quite anecdotal because, as I said, they haven't had the medical interventions, but even the people who were involved in the torture and detention were found to be senile very early in their in their lives. And this is it seems to be something that affects the mind in so many ways, and it's definitely studied internationally. Studies from other parts of Africa and Northern Ireland and war-torn countries where people who have been imprisoned, and in fact there's US study as well about solitary confinement and the effect on people. And it's interesting because the women were detained for standing up for what they believed in. They were not criminals. Um, it was towards for a cause, for a greater good. And despite that, and knowing the mental anguish of being alone in these gray, dark cells, or very brightly lit cells with awful food, possibly tainted food from what some of the recollections were, um, how it would have affected them physically and mentally, and then the effect of that on their children and the children who came afterwards was absolutely fascinating, and it really tells us a lot about where we are as a country collectively. So definitely something that was a huge theme in the book. And in fact, there was a journalist who'd interviewed Winnie Mandela closely, and she says that it was definitely post-traumatic stress from what from what her understanding of it was, but no known treatment despite that.
Do you still see it impacting, shadowing South Africa today?
Absolutely. When people wonder why we have these really strange small incidents like, road rage or whatever it is that turn very quickly into a racial um, fight, it's definitely from a lack of, uh, you know, recovering from this very big trauma that we had those years ago. And it's not something, and people still even now talk about forgiveness. It's actually one of the universities here is studying it, but how forgiveness is something, it's a lot to ask for of people who went through multiple generations of poverty and alienation and then imprisonment if you are an activist, to sort of turn a switch and to be okay with everything as it is now. As much as people embrace and love freedom, we have to um, think about the damage that was done, and I think it definitely results in these microaggressions, which people might find strange around the world. In fact, Donna, one of your books touches on it. There was an incident at a university where some students did really horrific things um, to the staff, and it was definitely a racial attack. And you would wonder, why would people do that, and why would this still be something that happens in today's world? And it's because we come from a society that needs to do a lot of work.
Mm. And I do see questions coming into the Q&A box, and I will definitely get to them. Keep them coming. And kind of a journalist to journalist question. You mentioned that officials misspelled Nonwe Mahtala's name in the court records, and I'm sure that added to the difficulties you face researching your book. What are some of the other challenges you face?
Well, it was 5 decades later. Although there was a lot that happened after the detention was a very central part of the book, because it showed how the women were connected. And even though some were friends, for instance, Winnie Mandela, Joyce Sikakane Rankin, and Shanthini Naidoo were friends and were in contact with each other. Manondwe was in the Eastern Cape and actually wasn't well known to them. And sure, it was interviewing her about her certificate that she received. And she actually went back to the South African government and said, please change the name on the certificate because you've misspelled my name. And um, you know, it was such a telling moment, because it showed how little was recorded. First of all, how little was recorded um, correctly, and then also again the male gaze and the sort of skewed history in terms of how these people were remembered. There was almost more research done internationally, and more there were newspaper cuttings from the New York Times that I found around the time, but to locally there wasn't a lot. And the challenge was also that the women are now in their mid 80s, so to try and remember in detail everything that had happened at the time, and to try and piece the bits the bits of the story together through their families who were away from them was it was a challenge, but it was also fascinating, and it was, I think, an opportunity for them to share something that they hadn't spoken about in a really long time. So yeah, and then also the other aspect that we had to deal with here in South Africa is that apartheid records were completely destroyed um, just before the turn of the democratic era, because of the evidence that would have been found in them, obviously. So yeah, it was a difficulty, but I'm very glad we managed to get it together and be able to share the story while these women are still alive.
Absolutely. As you say, the record was lacking, but I don't think that's the only reason that the stories were forgotten. What do you think are the deeper reasons for the forgetting?
You know, it is that age-old story of the singular narrative. It's you know, it's not taking away, you can't take away from Nelson Mandela's legacy, but as a figurehead, he was absolutely deserving of the recognition that he has worldwide. But it also almost shifted the spotlight away from other people, and it's not because it's not something that the person has done, or the organization that he belonged to has done, but it's about the way people want to see a really sanitized history. They want to see this peaceful person who came out of a prison after 27 years and didn't have um, hatred in his heart, which is a beautiful story. But it's actually difficult, and it's actually a little bit painful, and it's a lot more challenging to go deeper into these stories. And I think for that reason, people avoid them. But I know now, especially from reading the research around this, is that we we have to do it. It's something that's really, it's a part of us. It's in our DNA. It's been found to be, scientifically, that we carry the effects of slavery. We carry any trauma that was experienced by our forefathers is experienced by generations today. And this is absolutely relevant in the US as well, I'm sure. And I think that's why the book, Women Surviving Apartheid Prisons, although it may seem to be very, it is a South African story, and it's very, it tells a story of a South African moment in time, but it really is reflective of global society, how much there is still to tell, female stories that need to be told, and how they can be hidden unless you have a certain opportune moment of the stars aligning, or of things coming together, to let these stories be told. So I think um, that's something that's been really important and eye-opening for me, is that how many of these stories exist in the world.
And I definitely won't say it's a human story that you've told, but I think anyone can relate to. But I really feel it will resonate with Americans, particularly in the moment we're in right now. Earlier, you saw my daughter helping me get technically aligned for today, and I know that you have daughters as well. What have you learned from these women in your book that you want to be sure your daughters know about South Africa's history?
It's to firstly know that, as in all the difficulty, that there's still stories of triumph and bravery and love, and and lived experiences. For me, the stories also felt like, as a journalist, and this may sound strange, but it sounded like a really exciting time to have lived through. And I think the important lesson for that is, although it was really difficult and really, no one would have wanted to live during apartheid era South Africa, but at the same time, to be there and to make that impact on the world was an amazing opportunity. And it was a triumphant opportunity, because the women in the story, and it's told very early on, so I'm not giving away any spoilers, but they did stand together, and they did, they allowed each other to be released after that time, so that they could continue with the work. So it's definitely a story of resilience and grit and bravery. And I think for any young woman, that's the kind of story that will inspire for them to do this in a world that may not be as challenging as that, but to be able to face anything that comes at them.
Yes, the stories may have been forgotten, but the fact is those women did impact history. They maybe even changed history by holding firm. You quote in your book Kathy Kafrada, who's a well-known anti-apartheid leader, limiting that his partner, Barbara Hogan, is also, should be well-known, had not told her own story of incarceration and struggle. You mentioned that Joyce Sikakani Rankin has not finished her memoir, so I hope she does soon. And as we heard on the opening when your book was launched, South Africa's ambassador to the United States, who was a leading figure in the anti-apartheid movement, who was detained herself, has not told her story.
Mm-hmm.
I hope your book inspires women to tell those stories. What else do you think needs to be done to get these narratives out there?
So for me, it took the opportunity of being able to write about it in the many different aspects that I did, which was as a journalist in a newspaper, and then in academia, and then very fortunately to be able to write this as a book, and which has now been, which is now in another country, which is still amazing to me. I think it is about young people trying to recognize the work that has come before them, for them to live in the world that they are in now, and people who are doing amazing things right now to also record their own history. I was talking to young girls at a school today about Amanda Gorman, and to have a young person like that, also storytelling, which is in a different form. It's poetic. There are so many opportunities. You know, the women in this book were not didn't carry out their secret meetings and things like that with social media to help them. It was a completely, you know, the technology was just not there. Now we have so much and so many platforms to be able to share stories and hear them. And you don't have to be a writer or a journalist to do it anymore. You could be an ordinary person who has an Instagram account. Um, and I think that's something that's really powerful. We know how it can be destructive, but I think it's really, really powerful that we are able to tell our own stories and to be able to tell the stories of others who may not think that their story is something to be shared. Because, and that's the other thing about the women in women surviving apartheid prisons, is that they didn't think that they'd done anything remarkable. It was almost to take a step back and for them to realize that collectively they were part of a completely game-changing part of history. And sometimes it takes someone else to do that and to piece those pieces of the puzzle together. So, you know, we can only hope that there's more of that done, from sharing stories and also creating them.
And once their stories are shared, how do you get people to pay attention?
Absolutely. That's the other thing.
All right. As I said, we have some questions in the Q&A box, and I'm going to move to the, there's a couple in the chat too. I'll do the ones in the chat first so I don't forget them. One question wants to know, what prison were they in? Not Robben Island, you know that.
No, it was not Robben Island. It's called Pretoria Central. At the time that they were in prison, they were also temporarily held at what was called the Old Fort, which was a women's prison. But Pretoria Central, which is now called Kosi Mampuru prison, is actually in our nation's capital. Yes, one of the capitals. We've got three. And it was the prison that was designed to hold prisoners in solitary confinement. Again, Robben Island did have some solitary confinement, and there's a quote in Winnie Mandela's, one of her books, about how Nelson Mandela spent a whole 3 days in solitary confinement, compared to her 491, and how soul-breaking he found that to be. So he obviously identified very much with her extended solitary confinement. And yes, so this is the prison that the women were held in. And Robben Island is obviously an island prison off the coast of Cape Town, which is on the other end of the country compared to where Pretoria is.
And you know, Robben Island is famous now, but these names, the South Africans who lived through that period, the Pretoria Central and John Forster Square and the Old Fort, are menacing names. It's hard to put that across.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And then also in the chat, this is someone just quoting me, a quote I heard from Donna Bryson in another event about forgiveness. It's hard to understand the power of forgiveness if you don't understand the weight of the grievance. I think it's partly why you're telling these stories, to help explain the weight of the grievance. And another question, could you talk more about one or two specific contributions that women activists made to the fall of apartheid that are frequently overlooked? Perhaps progress on a particular issue, or maybe an event that had great significance that is overlooked or underplayed in historical accounts.
Absolutely. I think, you know, without being specific about an event, it's actually more about the daily contribution, which is still something that women do around the world. You know, it is. I always reference the Melinda Gates study about the unpaid work that women do around the world, and and how much that adds up to, and how that in our lifetime we probably spend the time it would take a medical time it would take to get a medical degree doing this unpaid work, which is, you know, caring for children and shopping and thinking about meals and all sorts of things. And it is a reality. And at the time, the parallel that I drew there is that these women who were, even if you take away the women who are in the story and you look at the women who are on the ground, who were the parents with the absent fathers, um, and who were the breadwinners, and who were the, you know, the people who ensured that the children were taken care of, as well as those who were a part of the activism at the time. I think that's almost more important than significant moments, because we did have really significant, you know, marches. In fact, Shanthini Naidoo's grandmother was very involved in mobilizing workers on farms and you know, against human rights abuses and things like that. So there were a number of those, but again, they're not widely spoken about. Um, and I think the value in the wider contribution is also something that is, it goes sort of unspoken and also unrecognized, because you can think about the prison time and you can think about the the fight for democracy, which was an ongoing struggle. But what happened in between? What happened every day? And I think that's where you find, you know, the other aspect of heroism.
A question from Carolyn Love. Has the book in any way influenced how people view the leadership of women and the important role in creating social change, and their important role in creating social change?
I think definitely so. I really appreciated the time and, you know, the acknowledgement from Ambassador Mfiketu, who's in Washington. Particularly, it was something that that was taken for granted, and you know, that there was a very sort of ineffective women's movement post apartheid, which should have been a part of the mainstream, um, you know, government, and it wasn't. It did very sort of, um, I wouldn't say frivolous, but it wasn't impactful work, which could have been done by having more women in the in our parliament. We are yet to have a female president. So, and I'm sure if, you know, you've got a similar situation in the US, but that's very positively changing, you know, with your new Vice President, Kamala Harris. And I'm not sure when South Africa will be at that stage yet. Hopefully it will be sooner than later. But I think it's something that also takes a bit of time and reckoning before we get there.
From Carol B. I read Donna Bryson's book, It's a Black-White Thing, based on time she spent in South Africa. I heard Ms. Naidoo mention parallels between the hidden stories of these women in South Africa and the Me Too movement in the US. I'm interested in what Ms. Bryson's thoughts might be, and Ms. Naidoo's, about white men in power and the current situation for women. I guess I have to go first there. It's interesting because I've just been reading a little bit about the situation in journalism. It's still a field, leadership in particular tends to be white and male, changing slowly. Just looking at some numbers on women photographers, a very small number of professional photographers, and a study of whose pictures get used on the front pages, and it's even smaller. I was kind of astonished at how small, particularly say the Wall Street Journal, how few women's pictures made by women make the front page. And I just know it's a matter of getting more people from all walks of life in positions to make decisions. What's your sense in South Africa?
Sure, it's a long struggle. The struggle is long, as they used to say in the old days. I think there's so much work to be done. There is just, you know, what I like about where we are now is that we are speaking about this. We are talking about how to implement change. And, you know, I was really amazed about how particularly Black women influence the vote in the US. And when that's made visible, I think it's the first step. It's to be able to see the power of women um, and to be able to then harness it. And I think it's in the harnessing is to almost let go and realize that actually we can do it, and we always could do it. So just allow us,
Mm.
or don't stand in our way.
Yeah, we can do it. See if we can do that. From Carolyn Love, has the stratification of race that existed during apartheid influenced how people identify and marginalize one another now?
Absolutely. I think this is still, like I said, it's a very young democracy, and it will take a lot of time. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been a huge amount of inroads. You know, there's a lot of work that's been done. We do it at every level in South Africa in terms of creating spaces that are more inclusive and we're very vocal about um, when situations aren't as they should be. For instance, in schools, and you know, parents today are absolutely or maybe sensitive towards to issues of race and stratification and immediately call it out and speak about it. And you know, transformation committees exist and have existed for a very very long time. But I think there's a shift that's happened in the world in the last few years. I don't know if it was something to do with the coronavirus and um, you know the globalization and you know and how much how connected we are as a world. But I think that it's also created opportunities for people to really say, if something is wrong, I'm not going to allow it to continue. Now is the time for me to make this change. We don't have time to waste anymore on you know when on inequality and on um, matters of race holding us back anymore. So there's always work to be done. We've seen that in the US, which has always been held in such high regard in terms of the um, of the you know by the entire world, and how it can still you can still have your White House stormed by radicals. You know, so um, it's ongoing. I think the only and one of the only ways to get to where we want to be is to continue storytelling and continue speaking about these things that we want to change.
From Alison Drew, women's role in the South African liberation struggle has been rendered invisible, and your book helps to reinsert them in history. To what extent has their invisibility impacted the present position of women in South Africa?
I think this is what we've spoken about this earlier on when I said we've yet to have a female president in South Africa, which is a figurehead, definitely, but it's symbolic of where we are as a country. And I, I, it would be difficult to draw a link between, you know, this story and our horrific gender-based violence stats in South Africa. But we do know that the trauma is linked to the reason behind gender-based violence. So in that way, I think it's definitely an effect that is with us and that will continue to be with us for a while.
And a question that goes back to the experiences of the specific women in your book. Were the women or their families provided with any compensation or living assistance afterward?
Nondri and Mankashla mentioned that there was a sort of pension for activists, but it wasn't significant. These women and their families are very, very ordinary South Africans you know, who weren't um, expecting to have high positions in government and things like that. Although Marita served in parliament and things like that, they're still very, very ordinary people. And this is one of the results of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that there was a fund set up, which was meant to be to make compensation available, and some of those funds have not been accessed yet. And actually, if it was to be accessed by every South African who was affected by apartheid, it would bankrupt the fiscus, I think.
Question, what is your opinion about how the women's role is represented in the Apartheid Museum?
It's really, it's wonderful, because the Apartheid Museum actually was one of the few places that had a family history of Shanthini Naidoo, which goes back to when Gandhi was in South Africa, fighting for the rights of indentured South African Indians, but it was indentured Indian immigrants, which is my generational background. So there has work that has been done, but again, it's a beautiful space, the Apartheid Museum, but it's a small space, and it's it should exist, I think, virtually in a much bigger context.
If I can squeeze in one more question, is there a glass ceiling in South Africa?
Very briefly, absolutely, and I think there are glass ceilings around the world.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to talk with you a little bit. I'm going to hand it over now to John Krieger from World Denver.
Thank you, Shanthini and Donna, for an important and enlightening conversation, and for bringing this history to light. I encourage everyone watching to go get Women Surviving Apartheid's Prisons. Here's the book. You can get it today at the Tattered Cover website or in their bookstores in the physical location. And I also recommend It's a Black White Thing by Donna Bryson, which we had the privilege to highlight last September. And we thank Tattered Cover and Just World Books for the invitation to participate in today's event. We hope that this is just the first of many collaborations between us and Tattered Cover and Just World Books in the future. World Denver is a nonprofit membership organization that facilitates international exchange and global engagement in the Mile High City. In a normal year, we bring about 600 international visitors to Denver to exchange ideas and expertise from around the world. And we thank those members and supporters like Donna, who have welcomed those visitors into their homes. You can learn more about World Denver and our programs and our opportunities to get involved at worlddenver.org. And please join us on March 8th when we celebrate International Women's Day with a live program broadcast from the Denver Center for Performing Arts. This year, we'll recognize the accomplishments of women working around the globe in peace and security. And we're proud to honor MSU President and former Undersecretary of the Navy, Dr. Janine Davidson. The event is free and open to all, and it's a virtual event, so you can join from anywhere around the world. So register to get today, again, at worlddenver.org. So finally, thank you once again to Shanthini and Donna, to the Tattered Cover, to Just World Books, and to all who have joined us today. Please stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see everyone again soon.